Good afternoon. The last afternoon of the last day of any conference is when we practice remnant theology. And so welcome to the faithful remnant. Many have taken in hand to discuss the validity of C.S. Lewis's apologetic arguments. I have been one of them last night. Here, I would like to address what we can learn practically about apologetics as a part of Christian ministry from Lewis's approach to defending the faith. Lewis was not a pastor, though Providence gave him an informal pastoral role in many lives, which is often on display in his letters. He was an evangelist of sorts, as well as the most effective apologist the church has ever known. So, a fresh look at his approach to these two areas of ministry and how they fit together could be useful to both evangelists and apologists in the 21st century. So, we are going to take a look at Lewis the Evangelist, at Lewis the Apologist, at what we can learn about Lewis, about apologetic methodology. We're going to look at Lewis as a practical apologist, and finally, Lewis and the final apologetic, a phrase you will recognize from Francis Schaeffer. So, first, evangelism. Lewis did not talk a lot about evangelism, he just did it. He often did it indirectly, but it got done. There's no direct appeal for conversion in the broadcast talks that became Mere Christianity, but there is an exposition of the Christian faith designed to elucidate its attractiveness as an answer to the problems of fallen man, as well as to underscore its truth. And conversion was often the result, as famously with Charles Colson. But while Lewis's approach to evangelism may have been indirect, it was not unintentional. When Sherwood Elliott Wirt of the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association asked Lewis whether he would say that the aim of his writing was to bring about an encounter of the reader with Jesus Christ, Lewis replied, "That is not my language, yet it is the purpose I have in view." He said elsewhere that most of my books are evangelistic, addressed to tous exo, Greek for those who are outside, those outside the church. Lewis did not feel that he had the gifts for the direct evangelical appeal of the come to Jesus type, but he thought that those who could do that sort of thing should do it with all their might. This all comes up from the Billy Graham crusade in London, which is the occasion on which Wirt interviewed Lewis for the Billy Graham magazine decision. Lewis not only practiced evangelism by writing, but also in his speaking on the radio, speaking for the RAF in World War II, and in personal letters and many other contacts. If you're interested in Lewis, you really need to get a hold of the massive 3-volume set of Lewis's not quite complete letters, because they keep finding new ones. But it's pretty complete, and you'll learn a couple of astonishing things from that. One is the reality of Lewis's conversion. You start in the first volume, and you're introduced to an arrogant prig with a very, very exalted view of himself and a very, very kinky set of interests in sexuality. And then his conversion takes place, and that person disappears and is replaced by somebody who takes chastity seriously as an ideal and means to practice it, and someone who takes humility seriously as an ideal and means to learn to practice that. And what's impressive about it is Lewis isn't talking about his conversion. Now, he does talk about it in letters to Arthur Greaves, But what I'm talking about is not those letters. It's just other letters where he's talking about something else. And you see the correlation with the dramatic transformation of his whole personality that his conversion wrought in him. The other thing you're going to find from there on throughout the entire rest of his life is an astonishing number of people that Lewis corresponded with. People who wrote to him with spiritual problems, emotional problems, ethical problems, and Lewis wrote them back and does this informal counseling role where he's definitely practicing evangelism in those letters. Lewis's commitment to evangelism and the price he paid for it at Oxford is well documented by David Mills in The Pilgrim's Guide, C.S. Lewis and the Art of Witness, especially in the late Chris Mitchell's essay, Bearing the Weight of Glory. Lewis's outspoken, forthright Christian testimony probably prevented him ever being promoted at Oxford. He was a tutor. In American academicese, that corresponds to instructor. He never even became a professor. You had instructor, assistant professor, associate professor, Lewis, a quarter of a century at Magdalen College, Oxford, and he's still a tutor. And only by moving to Cambridge was he admitted to a full professorship. And it's pretty clear that his Christian testimony demanded a price. It exacted a price. That's the word I'm looking for. Because it was just not according to Oxford academic etiquette for people to talk about things outside their discipline. So Lewis was tutor in English, and he's talking about theology and philosophy, and it's just like, you just don't do that. You especially don't show up the people who actually have the chairs in philosophy and theology by writing books that sell better than theirs. And so, Lewis was committed to evangelism, and he kept doing it, even though he paid a high personal price for doing so. Through all of these varied experiences, Lewis came to have a good understanding of some of the problems with doing effective evangelism in the modern world. One thing he noticed was that the greatest barrier I have met is the almost total absence from the minds of my audience of any sense of sin. We have to convince our hearers of the unwelcome diagnosis before we can expect them to welcome the good news of the remedy. This was a new situation without precedent in the history of the church. When the apostles preached, Lewis says, they could assume even in their pagan hearers a real consciousness of deserving the divine anger. Christianity now has to preach the diagnosis, in itself very bad news, before it can win a hearing for the cure. This means not an adjustment to the message, but more work for the evangelist, who can no longer do his work effectively without help from the apologist. Christ takes it for granted, Lewis says, that men are bad. Until we really feel this assumption of his to be true, though we are part of the world he came to save, we are not part of the audience to whom his words are addressed. You know, it's like I'm flipping through the channels, I see an infomercial about how to survive cancer, and since I don't have cancer, not going to waste that 30 minutes, and I keep flipping. Well, maybe I do have cancer, and I just don't know it. I mean, this is dealing with the modern audience. There's no hint in Lewis of the idea that we have to adjust the message to make it more palatable to this new, tougher audience. Rather, we must gird up our loins and do the work required to gain a hearing for this unwelcome diagnosis and the joyous cure that can only make sense when it follows it. So, Lewis committed to evangelism, Lewis getting some pretty practical understanding of the difficulties in doing evangelism with modern audiences, and as we indicated yesterday, The situation Lewis was noticing as something new, the situation he described in its infancy, has now grown to full maturity. And 80 years later, the difficulties he was talking about we face on steroids. So, that leads us from evangelism to apologetics. You probably can't read it. On the right, the gentleman is saying, "It's very commendable to support your position by quoting scripture, Farnsworth, but did you have to say, boom, I just dropped some Bible on you?" I just put that over there because I could. The evangelist increasingly needs help from the apologist because the diagnosis is no longer self-evident. And it is no longer self-evident, partly because the Christian worldview is now a foreign country to most people. They must be persuaded, the apologist's job, to try the experiment of looking at the world and their own hearts very differently from the way they habitually do, if they're even to understand the relevance of the gospel to their lives, much less accept it as good news that is true. The liberal approach to this dilemma is to try to accommodate the gospel to the modern or now postmodern worldview, to make it more palatable to the audience that exists. But this approach begs the question, if the gospel is not true, then it's not good news for anyone. And if it is true, then the modern worldview must at points be false. Lewis does not seem to have been tempted at all by the modern worldview, or by the liberal cop-out. He was fully prepared to accept the challenge that in order to present the good news today, we must, to an extent that was never necessary before, convince people that not just their behavior and their beliefs, but their thinking has been mistaken at crucial points. Apologetics is how we do this job. It is the defense of the faith, that branch of theology which asks of the gospel, why should we think it is true? It is the one branch of theology in which Lewis was recognized as an expert, if not a professional. His broad and deep learning, classical, philosophical, and literary, which kept him in touch with the best products of both the human mind and the human heart, his rigorous training in logic and debate by W.T. Kirkpatrick, the ancestor in the real world of Diggory Kirk, Professor Kirk in the Narnia books, who's modeled on Lewis's old tutor. Logic! Why don't they teach logic in those schools? There are only three possibilities. Either your sister is telling the truth, or she's lying, or she's mad. Now, it's perfectly obvious to everyone who sees her that she's not mad, and you tell me that she's truthful, so until any further evidence comes up, we must assume that she's telling the truth. It's all in Plato. What do they teach them in those schools? And so, that scene in Narnia, you're getting a little window into Lewis's life as a senior high school student in our terms, being prepped for Oxford by the great Knock. Now, I was actually trying to make a point about the lecture. His broad and deep learning, classical, philosophical, and literary, Lewis had a triple first-class degree in English, in classics, and in philosophy. Just to put that in context, you have to take a comprehensive exam at the end of your bachelor's program at Oxford. And your degree depends on how you do on that exam. You either get a first-class degree, which basically writes your ticket. Second-class degree is normal. Third class means you barely passed, or you plow, which means you just wasted your entire college career and leave without a degree. Lewis had a triple first. It's unheard of. A double first is really impressive. A triple first is almost unheard of. The Bodleian Library keeps on file those tests so that you can, if you're preparing for it, you can go back and get an idea of the kind of thing you might be asked. I looked up the one that Lewis took for his BA in English. It reminded me of nothing so much as my senior oral comprehensives for the PhD in English in about 1982. So Lewis had the equivalent of 3 modern doctorates, one in English, one in classics, one in philosophy. That, his rigorous training in logic and debate by Kirkpatrick, and the fact that his own conversion was facilitated by reasoned arguments from Chesterton and Tolkien, all these factors combine to make Lewis one of the greatest apologists we have ever seen. So what can he tell us about apologetics as a form of practical theology? Apologetics is needed for many reasons. In the first place, it is a biblical mandate. Sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to anyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, 1 Peter 3:15. The word translated defense is apologia, from which we get the English word apologetics. It's a courtroom term which refers to the kind of reasoned case a lawyer would make in defense of his client. Lewis was in tune with a number of the reasons why that mandate exists. One is the very nature of the faith to which the gospel calls us. Many modern people, Christians included, treat faith as a kind of strange, mystical way of knowing, unconnected to reason or evidence. They treat it as a zero-sum game in which the more reason and evidence you have for any given belief, the less of a role is left for faith to play. The New Testament, however, knows nothing of such ideas. For the New Testament writers, faith is simply trust, and salvation is granted to people who put their personal trust in Christ as God's Messiah. If you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you shall be saved. Romans 10:9. In Greek, the noun faith and the verb I believe are built on the same root, pistis, faith, pistuo, I believe. You could conceivably have that trust for good reasons or bad reasons or no reasons. I've met people who do all 3. It's better to have good reasons. Luke says that Jesus offered many convincing proofs of his resurrection, Acts 1:3, and early preachers like the Apostle Paul were constantly giving reasons and evidence to back up their message. So we could say that apologetics is based on a biblical precept, Peter's command, biblical precedent, the example of the apostles, and a biblical principle that the gospel is truth that should be addressed to the whole person, including the mind. Lewis accepted this biblical perspective fully. This acceptance is shown by his teachings on the nature of truth, by his practice of apologetics, and by direct statement. My faith is based on reason, he said. The battle is between faith and reason on one side and emotion and imagination on the other. The idea is not that emotion and imagination are inherently opposed to faith. One factor leading to Lewis's conversion was the baptism of his imagination by George MacDonald. But that in fallen human beings, they often are opposed to it. When reason appears to be opposed to faith, on the one hand, this opposition is illusory, because if the gospel is true, then true reason must support it. We practice apologetics in our evangelism then because of the nature of the gospel as truth and the nature of human beings as whole people who have minds as well as hearts that need to be reached. The nature both of the gospel and of human beings then makes apologetics necessary, a necessary part of our theology for every generation. The times in which we live can make the need even more pressing. Lewis lived in such times, and the needs he saw have not diminished since he saw them. A skeptical age will have its effects even on people raised in Christian homes. Lewis describes these effects graphically. He wrote to a Mrs. Lockley on the 5th of March, 1951, that skeptical, incredulous, materialistic ruts have been deeply engraved in our thought. As a result, even committed Christians like Lewis have moments when the Christian truth claims look implausible. What then will be the case for those without his apologetic defenses? In such an age, apologetics is essential equipment for believers wanting to preserve and strengthen their faith just as much as it is when they are proclaiming it to others. The ruts have not only been dug, There's Lewis with some RAF pilots that he spoke to during the Second World War. The roots have not only been dug, they are systematically reinforced. Lewis gives a very accurate analysis of the spirit of the age. As long as this deliberate refusal to understand things from above, even where such understanding is possible, continues, it's idle to talk of any final victory over materialism. The critique of every experience from below, the voluntary ignoring of meaning and concentration on fact, will always have the same plausibility. There will always be evidence, and every month fresh evidence to show that religion is only psychological, justice is only self-protection, politics only economics, love only lust, and thought itself only cerebral biochemistry. And it will always be evidence that can be used to give that impression because, in fact, the mind does work through the brain, and so you can always find something going on in the brain that corresponds to what the mind is doing. Doesn't follow that the brain is all that there is. The mindset Lewis is describing here is called reductionism. Every aspect of reality is reduced to one other thing that is held to explain it exhaustively. For the Marxist, everything is really economics. For the Freudian, everything is really just sex, etc. For the materialist, everything is only atoms in motion. So, in a materialist age, various forms of reductionism will be the default setting for understanding any aspect of human experience. The reason you can always find real evidence that seems to support reductionism is that thought, for example, does involve cerebral biochemistry. If you look at it only from below, biochemistry is all you will see. But there has to be more to it than that, because if thought is reduced to brain chemistry, then there's no reason to believe that thought is only brain chemistry. Because you think thought is only brain chemistry, and I think it's something more than that because of my brain chemistry. Who's going to judge between these two brain chemistries to decide which one is true? Well, the only option is somebody else's brain chemistry who is subject to the same limitations that we are. This leads us nowhere. The scientific age only accepts looking from below as valid looking. We are pounded by this mentality so consistently that it becomes one of the ruts that Lewis spoke of. We have to make a special and concerted effort to counteract the prejudices that result from such habits of how we look at things in order to be reminded that it cannot be the whole story. Apologetics is how we make that effort. Our age remains skeptical as Lewis's was, and to that challenge we have now added the ruts of pluralism and its offspring, multiculturalism. Lewis's ruts have been worn deeper and new ones have been added. Neither evangelism nor Christian nurture can be conducted effectively without help in navigating around, smoothing out, or bridging over those ruts. Therefore, Lewis's advice is even more pertinent today than it was when he gave it. To be ignorant and simple now, not to be able to meet the enemies on their own ground, would be to throw down our weapons and to betray our uneducated brethren who have under God no defense but us against the intellectual attacks of the heathen. Good philosophy must exist, if for no other reason, because bad philosophy needs to be answered. So, Lewis has a good understanding of why we need apologetics and of what it can do for us. Let's think for a little bit about apologetic method. There's Calvin and Hobbes over on the right. Calvin is going on about some kind of postmodern jargon that I can't even read from where I am. But it's a great cartoon. Modern Christian apologists tend to group roughly into three camps in terms of methodology: classical, evidentialist, and presuppositional. Classical apologists argue first for the existence of God and then turn to the evidence for the resurrection of Christ to identify who that God is and how he can be known. Evidentialists differ as to how valid the classical arguments, cosmological, teleological, moral, etc., are, but agree that they only point to an abstract God, not the God of the Bible, so they would prefer to cut to the chase and establish the historicity of the resurrection as pointing to Jesus being God incarnate. Presuppositionalists say we cannot argue to God, but only from God. In other words, our philosophical assumptions, presuppositions, determine how we are going to evaluate the evidence. And the non-Christian secular worldview and rebellious hearts will not let them hear the evidence objectively and conclude that Christ is Lord. So we have to start by showing that all starting points save one, the existence of the God of the Bible, lead to contradiction. Only after we accept God as God do we have a basis for using reason to evaluate the evidence. Increasingly, people are coming to see these approaches as complementary and indeed mutually interdependent rather than as alternative options. I think that is a healthy development. Unless you have reason to believe that a creator God exists, the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus only leads to the conclusion that something really weird must have happened. So, the classical guys have a point. Unless you see the strength of the evidence for the resurrection, the God of the classical arguments remains only abstract theory and not a personal savior. So the evidentialists have a point. Analyzing the worldview options and seeing the contradictions of secularism provides a context in which the evidence becomes meaningful. If the presuppositionalist can discipline himself not to condemn all the other approaches as unbiblical, in other words, a Schaefferian as opposed to Van Tillian presuppositionalist, can come to this table and partake in this feast. Presenting evidence alone surely does not lead to conversion, but presuppositionalism alone is susceptible to a charge of circularity. And no methodology is successful unless it is blessed and used by the Holy Spirit to bring about conviction and faith. And despite the purists on all sides, the Spirit has managed to use all three approaches in that way. C.S. Lewis was not part of the conversation that I have just summarized, and he does not discuss the advantages and disadvantages of these approaches. So why am I sticking that in this lecture? Because he is best understood in that context as a classical apologist who sometimes argued in ways more typical of evidentialists and presuppositionalists. He was, in other words, an eclectic realist with some common sense. Purists in the three approaches will not find an ally in Lewis, but practical apologists will find much good advice in how to approach their task. Lewis, in other words, followed what Doug Groothuis calls the cumulative case approach. Lewis uses many types of arguments: classical, the moral argument, the ontological argument; evidential, the trilemma; presuppositional, the argument from reason; and existential, the argument from desire. It's like Lewis had been listening to Phil's presidential address or something. Talk about being prescient. His case is not ultimately dependent on any one of them so much as on the fact that they all point to the same conclusion. He explains: authority, reason, and experience. On these three, mixed in various proportions, all our knowledge depends. The authority of many wise men in many different times and places forbids me to regard the spiritual world as an illusion. My reason, showing me the apparently insoluble difficulties of materialism and proving that the hypothesis of a spiritual world covers far more of the facts with far fewer assumptions, forbids me again. My experience, even of such feeble attempts as I have made to live the spiritual life, does not lead to the results which the pursuit of an illusion ordinarily leads to, and therefore forbids me yet again. Authority, reason, experience. When they agree, one can proceed with a certain amount of confidence. There are then a number of arguments pointing to the truth of the Christian faith, some of them quite strong. But Lewis realized that having good arguments is not enough. We also need to influence the general climate of opinion. In a secular age, unexamined attitudes and ideas influence our minds in ways that do not affect the validity of the reasons we've always had for believing in God, but may have a powerful effect on their plausibility. For example, Ransom insists that what we need for the moment is not so much a body of belief as a body of people familiarized with certain ideas. If we could even effect in 1% of our readers a changeover from the concept of space to the concept of heaven, we should have made a beginning. It's from the Space Trilogy. Space is a vast, unpopulated emptiness in which life is an anomaly. Heaven is a vibrant matrix of being, pulsating with life and light. How we imagine the world has an influence on how we think about it, the kinds of arguments we will be drawn to, and the kind of conclusions we will draw from them. Lewis's arguments were effective then partly because he knew that more than argument was needed. In Lewis's Apologetic, they were supplemented by attempts to imagine what the world would look like if Christianity were true. Narnia, the Field of Orual, as well as arguments that were not directly about apologetic issues. Lewis wanted Christians to pursue intellectual excellence in general in order to create a situation in which people were not so unused to seeing things from the perspective of the Christian worldview as they were already becoming in his generation. What we want, he said, is not more little books about Christianity, but more little books by Christians on other subjects. When the best available treatments of art, literature, politics, philosophy, ethics, and science all speak as if Christianity were true, without necessarily even directly mentioning it, then when the time comes to make the case for its truth directly, a receptive audience will have been created. We have much work left to do in this area. Lewis was also an effective apologist because he was winsome and intelligent. One of my favorite passages is one in which he slyly turns the table on the skeptics. As an atheist, Lewis had to believe that the great majority of the human race was wrong. When I became a Christian, he remarks, I was able to take a more liberal view. Here he steals a favorite buzzword, liberal, and a favorite stance, that of tolerant open-mindedness, from his opponents, and stands them on their heads to be used against them. Who is really open-minded? Lewis makes his point, but he doesn't rub it in. He makes it and he moves on. We could learn a lot from him in manner as well as in message. Lewis had a unique gift for being able to express the most profound Christian ideas that apologetics needs to defend in language that normal human beings can understand. Now, this was a gift, but it's also a skill that can be cultivated. Lewis wrote to John Beddoe in October of 1945, "It has always seemed to me odd that those who are sent to evangelize the Bantus begin by learning Bantu, while the church turns out annually curates to reach the English who simply do not know the vernacular language of England." He also stressed that you do not really even understand a concept if you cannot translate it into the vernacular. He thought such translation ought to be a compulsory paper for every ordination examination. You give the candidate a passage of abstruse academic theology, translate this into normal English without losing any of its content. If you can't pass, you don't get ordained. That was good advice for the apologist as well as the pastor and the evangelist. Sadly, today in academia, there is a prejudice to the effect that writing cannot be intellectual if it is intelligible. Lewis's entire corpus gives the lie to that erroneous notion. It would be good if a host of theologians and apologists following his example, like us, would give the lie to it also. Lewis was also careful not to claim too much. He gives multiple arguments to the best explanation and does not typically claim to have a slam dunk proof. He wrote to Sheldon Van Auken in December of 1950, "I do not think there is a demonstrative proof like Euclid of Christianity, nor of the existence of matter, nor of the goodwill and honesty of my best and oldest friends. I think all three are far more probable than the alternatives. Not only does this approach relieve us of the burden of trying to prove more than we can, it's also consistent with the nature of the response we're looking for. As Lewis further explained, God does not give us a demonstrative proof because a response of mere intellectual assent is not what he is after. Are we interested in it in personal matters? Lewis asks. The very fairy tales embody the truth. Othello believed in Desdemona's innocence when it was proved. Othello's wife, Desdemona, had been accused of adultery. He murdered her in revenge. And approximately 5 seconds later, it was revealed to him that the charges were false. Lear believed in Cordelia's love when it was proved, but that was too late. King Lear disinherited his daughter Cordelia because he misunderstood something she had said. She turns out to be the only one of his three daughters who actually did love him, and he finds out that this is true right after she gets hung and killed. So, two examples from Shakespeare. Lewis kind of assumed we would all take those as equivalent to examples from life, which they should be. But the point is, proof is only part of it. Yeah, we want to give good evidence. But faith, personal trust, is what we're after. And faith is not indifferent to evidence, but we do not value faith very highly when it is given only if there is no intellectual alternative, or when it wavers with every fluctuation of the ebb and flow of circumstances. Thomas, come here. Get Joe Carcass over here. Put your hand in the scars. And Thomas is like, my Lord and my God. Do you believe because you have seen? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet are going to believe. Yeah, we want evidence. We care about evidence. We're not indifferent to the evidence, but we're not looking for people to adopt a certain set of academic opinions that they will tick the box for on an opinion poll. We're looking for personal commitment to Christ, which includes evidence but goes far beyond it. Lewis amazingly understood that and understood it very well. And the fact that he doesn't put everything in the apologetics basket. In other words, apologetics is part of a life that gives testimony to Christ. It's a necessary part. But, how many times the last 5 years or so have I seen somebody say, people write opinions on apologetics groups, in Facebook. If we could just get people to start doing apologetics, then the exodus from the churches would... No. By itself, that wouldn't help. It's a spiritual warfare thing. And we have to approach it that way. Apologetics is necessary but not sufficient. It has to be part, but it has to be part of something greater than just argument. Lewis, in other words, would have agreed with Francis Schaeffer that the final apologetic is a life lived as if the Christian message were true. Lewis noted, if Christianity should happen to be true, then it is quite impossible that those who know this truth and those who don't should be equally well equipped for leading a good life. Christians so equipped should indeed be leading a life that not only exhibits human thriving from the application of Christian truths, but also a sacrificial commitment to showing the love of Christ to each other and to the world. Without this final apologetic, Schaeffer's language for that aspect of it, no argument will be compelling to people from whom we are asking not just intellectual assent, but life commitment. And to some, it will be the only argument that can speak. As Lewis wrote to a Miss Gidding in June of 1945, when a person has lost his faith under so great and bewildering a trial, no intellectual approach is likely to avail. But where people can resist and ignore arguments, they may be unable to resist lives. Well, the finitude of time is such an annoying aspect of reality, and it has brought us to the conclusion. Why do we need apologetics? Because we live in a world filled with people who think and act like Trumpkin. I have no use for magic lions, which are talking lions and don't talk, and friendly lions, though they don't do us any good, and whopping big lions, though nobody can see them. The only cure for that attitude was for Trumpkin to actually meet Aslan. Well, we are all of us constitutionally unbelieving Narnian dwarfs. You see, Aslan said, they will not let us help them. They have chosen cunning instead of belief. Their prison is only in their own minds. They are in that prison, though, and are so afraid of being taken out that they cannot be, so afraid of being taken in that they cannot be taken out. Well, Lewis can help us provide the apologetic element of that life of testimony and the rest of it too, that gives witness to Christ, that is the kind of witness we are called to offer because it's the kind, nothing less, that he deserves. I regret we don't have time for questions, but you can grab me afterwards if you like.